She steps into the ballroom, and every candle in the room seems to lean toward her, as if even the fire wants to see her face. Heads turn. Fans pause mid-air. A young man near the punch table forgets the sentence he was speaking to his friend. She does not know yet that tonight will break something inside her chest that no apology will ever fully mend. The Duke crosses the floor toward her, and for one heartbeat, she believes he is coming to claim her hand for the first dance. Instead, his eyes pass over her like she is furniture someone forgot to remove from the room. A noblewoman beside him laughs softly, waiting for the introduction with hungry curiosity. The Duke opens his mouth, and what comes out of it will follow this young woman through every room she ever enters again. She lowers her head before the words even finish leaving his lips, because some part of her already senses what shame feels like before it arrives. I am not going to tell you what he said yet. I want you to sit with that silence for one more second. The same silence she had to sit in, surrounded by people who were watching her face instead of looking away out of mercy. Tell me something before we go further. If a room full of strangers heard someone call you nobody, would your spine still hold you upright? Or would you nod too, the way she did? Drop your answer below and tell me which corner of the world you are watching this from tonight, because I read every single comment and I reply to as many as I can. Subscribe before we continue, because this story does not end where you think it does. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones of Bramfield Lane, and inside it sat a young woman named Margaret Cole, her gloved hands folded tightly over a letter she had read so many times the creases had begun to tear. The letter was an invitation to the grandest ball the county had seen in years, hosted by the Duke of Penmore, a man whose name alone could silence a room. Margaret had not been invited because of her own standing. She had been invited because her aunt, a woman named Harriet Bell, had begged a favor from a distant cousin who served in the Duke's household, and that favor had finally been granted. Margaret was the daughter of a man who once owned a modest shipping business before debts swallowed it whole. Her father had died 3 winters ago, leaving behind unpaid accounts and a daughter who had learned to mend her own dresses rather than buy new ones. She was not poor enough to be pitied openly, but she was not wealthy enough to be welcomed without question. She lived in that uncomfortable space between classes, where people smiled at her, and then whispered the moment she turned away. Her aunt sat across from her in the carriage, fussing over the ribbon in Margaret's hair. "Sit straight, child. Tonight is not a night for slouching shoulders," Harriet said, tugging the ribbon one final time before letting her hands fall into her lap. "If the Duke so much as glances your way, you must not look frightened. Men like him can smell fear the way hounds smell blood." Margaret nodded, though her stomach twisted at the thought of being noticed by anyone, let alone a duke. She did not want attention. She wanted only to slip into the ballroom unseen, watch the dancing from a quiet corner, and slip back out before anyone asked who she was or why she had come. She did not know, as the carriage rolled closer to Penmore Hall, that tonight would not allow her the mercy of invisibility. The Duke of Penmore, a man named Thomas Ainsworth, stood near the entrance of his own ballroom, greeting guests with the practiced patience of someone who had done this every season since he was a boy. He was tall, with dark hair that refused to stay combed, no matter how his valet tried, and eyes that many described as kind, though tonight those eyes carried a heaviness few could read. Thomas had not wanted to host this ball. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Ainsworth, had insisted on it, claiming the family needed to remind society that the Ainsworth name still mattered, even after the scandal that had quietly followed them for the past year. Thomas had agreed only because refusing his mother on this particular matter would have caused more talk than the ball itself. Beside him stood a woman named Beatrice Langley, daughter of an earl, dressed in a manner that left no doubt about her family's wealth. Beatrice had attached herself to Thomas's side the moment she arrived, speaking as though their courtship was already a settled matter, though Thomas had made no such promise to her or to anyone. "You must introduce me to everyone of importance tonight," Beatrice said, her fan moving lazily in front of her face. "I do so hate standing beside strangers I am forced to pretend I know." Thomas offered a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. He had learned long ago that smiling without meaning it was sometimes the only way to survive an evening like this. Across the room, a young man named Frederick Doyle watched the entrance with sharp interest. Frederick was the son of a baron, recently returned from his studies abroad, and he had a reputation for noticing things others missed. Tonight, he noticed the way the Duke's jaw tightened every time Beatrice spoke, and he wondered, not for the first time, what kept a man so clearly unhappy, bound to a woman he did not seem to want. When Margaret finally stepped through the doors of Penmore Hall, the room did not erupt into gasps. It was quieter than that, and somehow more dangerous. Conversations slowed, fans paused mid-motion, a few eyes lingered on her face, a heartbeat longer than politeness allowed, because there was something about her, an unguarded honesty in her expression, that made people want to look twice. Margaret felt the weight of those glances settle on her shoulders like a heavy shawl she had not asked to wear. She kept her eyes low, her steps small, hoping to fade into the edges of the room. Her aunt, however, had other plans. "Come, child," Harriet whispered, gripping Margaret's elbow and steering her directly toward the cluster of guests surrounding the Duke. "This is precisely the moment we came for." Margaret's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She wanted to pull back, to insist they find a quieter corner first, to breathe before being thrust into the center of attention. But her aunt's grip was firm, and resisting in public would only draw more eyes toward her, so she allowed herself to be led forward, like a lamb walking toward a gate she did not understand. Thomas noticed her before she reached him. He noticed the way she held herself, neither boastful nor cowering, simply present, as though she were trying very hard to take up as little space as possible while still being polite enough to greet the people around her. There was something almost unbearably honest about her posture, something he had not seen in any of the carefully trained young women who usually crowded his ballroom. Beatrice noticed Thomas noticing her, and her fan stilled instantly. "Who is that?" Beatrice asked, her voice losing its earlier sweetness, sharpening into something colder. Before Thomas could answer, Harriet had already brought Margaret to stand directly before him, curtsying low enough to make her intentions clear to everyone watching. "Your Grace," Harriet said, beaming with a pride that did not match the situation at all. "Allow me to present my niece, Margaret Cole. She has been so looking forward to attending one of your wonderful gatherings." The words hung in the air, polite and ordinary, the kind of introduction given 100 times a night at gatherings like this one. Margaret rose from her own curtsy and lifted her eyes just enough to meet the Duke's gaze, hoping for nothing more than a brief nod, a single moment of acknowledgement before she could retreat into the safety of the crowd. But Beatrice was already speaking again, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small circle of guests nearby. Cole, Beatrice repeated, tasting the name as though testing whether it deserved to exist in this room. I do not believe I know that family at all. Are they from the county, or somewhere further out where such names are more common? A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the circle, the kind people give not because something is truly funny, but because they want to seem aligned with whoever holds the most power. Margaret felt her face grow warm, the heat climbing from her neck to her cheeks, but she kept her chin steady, refusing to let the question undo her so quickly. Thomas felt the shift in the air immediately, the way a man feels a storm approaching before the first drop of rain falls. He glanced at his mother, who stood several feet away, watching the exchange with an expression Margaret could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and calculation. "She is the daughter of a respectable family from Bramfield," Thomas said, his tone even, attempting to close the matter before it grew into something larger. But Beatrice was not finished. She stepped closer to Margaret, her eyes sweeping over the modest fabric of her gown, the simplicity of her hairstyle, compared to the elaborate styles favored by the other women in attendance. "How charming," Beatrice said, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. It is always so refreshing to see new faces at these events, even if one has never heard of them before tonight. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what words might come, when a voice behind her interrupted the moment entirely. "Your Grace," called a portly man named Walter Green, a wealthy merchant eager to gain the Duke's favor for a business proposal he had been rehearsing all week. "Might I borrow a moment of your time? It concerns a matter of some urgency." Thomas hesitated, caught between the unfinished tension surrounding Margaret and the demands of a guest he could not ignore. Walter Green was not a man of noble blood, but his investments mattered to several families in attendance, including his own mother's quiet financial arrangements. "Forgive me," Thomas said, glancing briefly at Margaret with an expression that almost looked like apology, before allowing himself to be pulled away by Walter's insistent hand. Margaret stood there, abandoned in the middle of a circle that no longer seemed interested in pretending kindness now that the Duke had stepped away. Beatrice's smile sharpened further, sensing an opportunity now that the one person who might have softened the moment had been called elsewhere. "Tell me, Miss Cole," Beatrice said, drawing the word "miss" out, as though it were a question rather than a title. "What exactly brings you to a gathering such as this? Surely it cannot be for the company of people you have never met." Margaret felt her aunt stiffen beside her, sensing the danger but unsure how to retreat without making the situation worse. Margaret straightened her spine instead, drawing on whatever courage remained after the morning's nerves and the carriage ride's anxious silence. "I was invited, the same as everyone else here tonight," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her ribs. "Invited," Beatrice repeated, turning to glance at the small audience that had gathered to watch the exchange unfold. "How strange. I do not recall the Duke mentioning your family at all when the guest list was discussed." Frederick Doyle, who had been watching the entire scene from a few steps away, finally moved closer, sensing the cruelty building beneath Beatrice's carefully polite words. He had no particular loyalty to Margaret, having never met her before tonight, but something in him disliked watching a stranger be cornered for sport. "Perhaps the guest list was simply too long for every name to be discussed in detail," Frederick offered, his tone light, attempting to deflate the tension building around them. Beatrice barely glanced at him, dismissing his comment with the same ease she might dismiss a servant offering an unwanted opinion. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone nearby. She studied Margaret for a long moment, her eyes moving from the modest gown to the steady, unflinching way Margaret held her gaze despite the humiliation building around her. "Cole," Eleanor said slowly, as though turning the name over in her mind. "I believe I once knew a man by that name. A shipping merchant, if memory serves." Margaret's heart clenched. "Yes, Your Grace." "My father." "Was," Eleanor repeated, her eyebrow lifting slightly. "I take it he has passed, then?" 3 years ago," Margaret answered, refusing to let her voice waver despite the painful subject. A flicker of something unreadable passed across Eleanor's face, gone before anyone could name it. She said nothing further, simply nodding once before turning away to attend to other guests, leaving Margaret standing there, unsure whether she had just survived an interrogation or merely postponed a harsher one. Across the room, Thomas finished his conversation with Walter Green far sooner than he intended, his mind only half engaged with the man's business proposal. Something about Margaret's expression as he walked away had lodged itself uncomfortably in his thoughts, refusing to let him focus on numbers and investment figures. When he returned to the circle, he found Beatrice standing victorious, Margaret's cheeks flushed with the effort of holding herself together, and his mother already moving toward the next cluster of guests, as though nothing of consequence had occurred at all. "Has something happened here?" Thomas asked, his eyes moving between Beatrice's satisfied expression and Margaret's carefully composed face. "Nothing at all," Beatrice said sweetly, looping her arm through his before he could step away. "Miss Cole and I were simply becoming acquainted." Thomas studied Margaret a moment longer, searching for some sign of what had truly transpired in his absence. But Margaret offered only a small, polite smile, unwilling to make a scene by contradicting Beatrice in front of so many watching eyes. It was at this exact moment that an older gentleman, a respected colonel named Gerald Fitzhugh, approached the group with another guest in tow, eager to introduce his visiting nephew to society's most influential circle. "Your Grace," Gerald said warmly, "allow me to present my nephew, who recently arrived from his commission abroad." Thomas turned to greet the newcomer, and in that brief moment of distraction, Beatrice leaned close to his ear, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "You really must be more careful who you allow your mother to invite," Beatrice murmured. "It reflects poorly on the family to entertain guests of such uncertain background." Thomas's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Gerald's nephew extended a hand toward him, eager for the Duke's attention, and the moment for private conversation slipped away entirely. It was then that the true cruelty of the evening arrived, dressed in the simple shape of an introduction. Gerald, eager to be thorough, turned toward Margaret with genuine warmth, clearly hoping to include her in the circle of new acquaintances. "And who is this lovely young lady?" Gerald asked, smiling kindly at Margaret in a way that suggested no malice at all, only old-fashioned courtesy. Thomas, distracted by Beatrice's whispered words, still echoing uncomfortably in his mind, by the weight of his mother's earlier scrutiny, and by the growing pressure of Gerald's expectant gaze, answered before he could fully consider his words. "She is nobody important," Thomas said, the words leaving his mouth quickly, carelessly, meant only to move the conversation forward without complication. The moment the words left him, silence dropped over the small circle like a curtain falling at the end of a tragic play. Margaret felt the words strike her chest with a force that seemed to steal the air from her lungs entirely. She had braced herself for Beatrice's cruelty all evening. She had not braced herself for this. For the one person who had spoken to her with anything resembling kindness moments before, to dismiss her so completely, so carelessly, as though she were nothing more than an inconvenient detail in his evening. She lowered her head, not because she agreed with the words, but because she did not know where else to direct the shame suddenly crashing over her in front of every watching eye. Her cheeks burned, her throat tightened around words she could not force herself to speak. She simply nodded, the smallest, saddest motion, an unspoken agreement to a sentence she had not chosen and did not deserve. Frederick, standing close enough to witness everything, felt something tighten uncomfortably in his chest at the sight of her bowed head. Gerald, realizing too late the damage his innocent question had caused, opened his mouth to soften the moment, though no words came quickly enough to undo what had already been said. Thomas, hearing his own words echo back at him through the sudden silence, felt something cold settle into his stomach as he watched Margaret's chin drop, her eyes fixed on the polished floor beneath her shoes. He had not meant the words the way they landed. He had meant only to deflect attention, to avoid further entanglement in his mother's careless invitation, to keep Beatrice's jealous scrutiny from finding a new target. But watching Margaret nod in quiet, wounded agreement, he understood, far too late, that words spoken carelessly could cut just as deeply as words spoken with cruelty intended. Harriet, standing beside her niece, felt fury and helplessness rise together inside her chest, though she said nothing, knowing any protest now would only humiliate Margaret further in front of so many watching faces. The orchestra, unaware of the small tragedy unfolding near the ballroom's edge, began a new song, the bright notes clashing painfully against the silence still hanging over the small circle of guests. Margaret lifted her eyes only once, just enough to meet Thomas's gaze for a single, unbearable second, and in that brief glance he saw something he would not be able to forget for many nights to come. Not anger, not even sadness exactly, but a quiet, devastating acceptance, as though she had expected the world to confirm what she had always feared about her own worth. And tonight, it finally had. Harriet finally found the courage to speak, though her voice was unsteady. "We should not have come," she whispered close to Margaret's ear, her fingers tightening around her niece's arm, as though she could shield her from any further harm simply by holding on. Margaret said nothing in return, afraid that speaking now would crack whatever fragile composure still held her upright in front of so many strangers. Frederick stepped nearer, uncertain what comfort he could offer a woman he had only just met, yet unwilling to walk away while she stood there alone in the wreckage of a single careless sentence. He opened his mouth to speak some small kindness, though no words felt adequate enough for the moment. Before he could find them. Margaret turned, lifted her chin despite the trembling in her shoulders, and walked toward the nearest doorway, leaving the ballroom and its glittering crowd behind her, while Thomas stood frozen in place, watching her go, already sensing that this single, careless sentence would not be the end of what passed between them tonight. Margaret did not stop walking until she reached the garden behind Penmore Hall, where the cold night air finally allowed her chest to loosen enough to draw a full breath. She pressed her gloved hand against a stone pillar, steadying herself, refusing to let the tears building behind her eyes fall in a place where anyone might still see her. Harriet found her there moments later, breathless from hurrying through the corridors. "Margaret, we should leave at once," Harriet said, wrapping a shawl around her niece's shoulders that she had grabbed hastily from a servant near the cloakroom. "There is no reason to remain in a house that has shown us such disrespect?" Margaret nodded slowly, though something inside her had already hardened into a quiet resolve that went beyond simply leaving the party. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply allowed her aunt to lead her toward the waiting carriage, her spine straight, her expression unreadable, as though she had decided in that single moment that no one in that ballroom would ever again witness her shame. Inside Penmore Hall, Thomas excused himself from Gerald and his nephew as quickly as courtesy allowed, his mind consumed entirely by the image of Margaret's bowed head. He searched the ballroom for her, weaving between clusters of guests who tried to catch his attention with questions about the orchestra or the refreshments, none of which mattered to him at that moment. "Your Grace, where are you off to in such haste?" called a sharp voice belonging to a woman named Priscilla Hargate, a widow known throughout the county for her endless gossip and her sharper tongue. Surely the host cannot abandon his own ball. Thomas offered no answer, continuing past her toward the corridor that led to the garden, only to find it empty except for a single dropped glove lying near the stone pillar where Margaret had stood minutes before. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, feeling a strange weight settle into his chest at the sight of something so small and ordinary becoming suddenly so significant. Beatrice appeared behind him, her earlier triumph replaced by mild irritation at his disappearance from her side. "There you are," Beatrice said, her eyes narrowing slightly at the glove in his hand. "Whatever are you doing out here alone?" "Nothing of consequence," Thomas answered, slipping the glove into his coat pocket. Before Beatrice could ask further questions, he had no wish to answer honestly. Back inside the ballroom, Frederick found himself standing near Gerald, both men quietly troubled by what they had witnessed. "That was unkind, even for a careless remark," Frederick said, watching the dance floor without truly seeing it. Gerald nodded grimly. "I fear I am partly to blame for pressing the introduction at all. Though I confess I did not expect such a response from a man I always believed to be more thoughtful than that." Across the room, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor watched her son's troubled expression with quiet calculation. She had not missed the way Thomas's eyes had followed the young woman named Cole throughout the brief encounter, nor the way his jaw had tightened the moment the careless words left his mouth. Eleanor had her own reasons for wanting the Cole family kept at a careful distance from her son, reasons rooted in a debt from years ago that she had hoped would remain buried in old correspondence and forgotten ledgers. The following morning, Thomas rose early, instructing his valet to prepare his horse before the household had even finished its breakfast preparations. He intended to ride to Bramfield himself, to offer whatever apology Margaret might accept, though he was uncertain what words could possibly undo the damage of the previous evening. When he arrived at the modest cottage where Margaret lived with her aunt, he was met not by Margaret herself, but by a stern-faced housekeeper named Agnes Webb, who informed him plainly that Miss Cole was not receiving visitors that morning, nor likely any morning soon after. Thomas left a written note instead, sealed carefully, expressing regret for words spoken without thought, and asking for the chance to explain himself properly. He handed it to Agnes with instructions to deliver it directly into Margaret's hands. Agnes did deliver the note, though Margaret read only the first line before setting it aside unanswered, her expression carefully blank as she returned to the mending in her lap. "He thinks an apology, written on fines paper, can undo what he said in front of half the county," Margaret murmured to her aunt later that afternoon, her needle moving steadily through the fabric despite the tightness in her chest. "Some wounds are not healed with ink." Harriet said nothing, though she watched her niece carefully, noticing the way Margaret's hands trembled slightly, despite her composed voice. 3 days passed in this manner, with Thomas sending a fresh note each morning, each one returned unread or acknowledged only with silence. On the 4th day, he arrived in person again, only to be turned away once more at the door, this time by Margaret herself, who appeared briefly in the window above, before disappearing without a single word exchanged between them. Meanwhile, Beatrice grew increasingly suspicious of Thomas's frequent absences from social engagements he would normally attend without fail. She enlisted the help of her cousin, a calculating young woman named Josephine Vale, who had a talent for discovering information others wished kept hidden. "Find out where the Duke has been riding off to every morning," Beatrice instructed Josephine over tea, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I do not appreciate being kept in the dark about matters that concern my own future." Josephine, eager to please her cousin and secure her own favor within the family's growing influence, agreed readily, setting her own quiet investigation into motion within days. It was Josephine who eventually traced Thomas's rides to the modest cottage in Bramfield, returning to Beatrice with news that sent a cold fury rippling through the other woman's carefully composed expression. "The Cole girl," Beatrice repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "He rides to her cottage nearly every morning. And for what purpose, might I ask?" "I could not say for certain," Josephine admitted, though the housekeeper there seemed quite accustomed to turning him away at the door. Beatrice's mind began working quickly, calculating how best to use this information to her advantage, before it could grow into something she could no longer control or contain. That evening, Eleanor summoned Thomas to her private study, her expression carrying none of the warmth she usually reserved for their conversations. "I understand you have been riding to Bramfield with some regularity," Eleanor said, settling into her chair with the deliberate calm of a woman accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. Thomas met his mother's gaze steadily. "I spoke carelessly to Miss Cole at the ball, and I intend to apologize properly, regardless of how long it takes her to accept it." Eleanor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "There are matters concerning the Cole family that you do not fully understand, Thomas. Matters from years before you were even born." "What matters?" Thomas asked, his curiosity sharpening, despite the tension already thick in the room. Eleanor hesitated, weighing how much truth to reveal before finally choosing silence instead. "It is not important now," she said simply. "What matters is that you cease this foolish pursuit before it causes further talk among our circle. The Langley family expects an understanding between you and Beatrice, and continued attention toward a girl of no standing will only invite scandal neither of us can afford." Thomas studied his mother carefully, sensing the evasion beneath her words, but unwilling to press further that evening, though the conversation left him more determined than ever to understand exactly what history connected his family to Margaret's. That same week, a quiet rumor began circulating through the servants' quarters of Penmore Hall, carried by a young footman named Samuel Reed, who had overheard fragments of a conversation between Eleanor and her solicitor regarding an old debt connected to a shipping venture from many years before. Samuel, eager for a coin or two, repeated what he had heard to a stable hand, who repeated it further still, until the fragments reached Frederick through a chain of idle gossip, neither accurate nor complete. Frederick brought the rumor to Thomas cautiously, unwilling to add further confusion to an already tangled situation. "There is talk among the staff of an old arrangement between your family and a shipping venture," Frederick said carefully. "Nothing certain, only fragments. But the timing troubles me given what your mother said." Thomas turned the information over slowly in his mind, wondering whether his mother's evasiveness and Margaret's father's failed business were somehow connected by threads neither woman seemed willing to pull into the light. He resolved to ask Eleanor directly once more, though he suspected she would offer him nothing beyond the same careful silence as before. Beatrice did not wait long before setting her own plan into motion. Simple jealousy would not be enough to remove Margaret from Thomas's thoughts entirely. Something more decisive was needed, something that would ensure Margaret herself wanted nothing further to do with the Duke, regardless of how many apologies he offered. She summoned Josephine once more, this time with a request far more deliberate than simple information gathering. "I want a letter written," Beatrice said, pacing slowly across her sitting room. "A letter that appears to come from the Duke himself, suggesting his visits to Bramfield were never about apology at all, but about settling an old debt owed by her late father. Nothing more than a transaction, dressed up as concern." Josephine hesitated. "That seems a dangerous game to play, cousin. If discovered, it could ruin you both." "It will not be discovered," Beatrice said coldly, "because you will ensure the handwriting matches his closely enough that no one thinks to question it." Within 2 days, the forged letter found its way into Margaret's hands, delivered by a paid messenger who claimed only that a gentleman had asked for its delivery without revealing his name. Margaret read the letter alone in her room, her hands growing colder with each line. The forged words claimed that Thomas's family had once loaned a significant sum to her father before his business collapsed, and that the Duke's recent attention toward her was nothing more than an attempt to recover what remained of that debt through whatever means necessary, including, the letter suggested cruelly, securing her favor under false pretense of affection. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack further, though she had believed little remained to break after the ballroom's humiliation. She had not expected kindness from Thomas, not truly. But the idea that his visits, his notes, his persistent attempts at apology had all been calculated, maneuvers toward hidden financial gain, felt like a betrayal, sharper than the original insult itself. She did not show the letter to her aunt. She simply folded it and placed it inside a drawer, along with a fresh resolve that no further visits from the Duke would be tolerated, regardless of his intentions, real or invented. The next morning, when Thomas arrived once more at the cottage, Margaret herself answered the door before Agnes could intervene, her expression colder than he had ever seen it. "I would ask that you cease these visits entirely," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the storm building behind her eyes. "Whatever business remains between your family and mine can be settled through proper correspondence with my aunt. There is no need for further pretense." Thomas blinked, confused by the sudden shift in her tone. "Pretense," he repeated. "Margaret, I came only to apologize for my careless words. I have no business with your family beyond that." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Please do not insult me further by pretending ignorance. I know now why you have truly been riding to Bramfield each morning, and it has nothing to do with apology at all." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Margaret stepped back and closed the door firmly, leaving him standing alone on the modest porch, utterly bewildered by an accusation he could not begin to understand. He rode back to Penmore Hall in confusion, his mind racing through every possible explanation for Margaret's sudden hostility, though nothing he considered matched the cold certainty he had seen in her expression. It was Frederick, visiting the estate later that week, who first noticed Thomas's troubled state and pressed him gently for an explanation. "Something has happened between you and Miss Cole," Frederick observed, watching Thomas stare absently out the window of his study. You have not been yourself since your last visit to Bramfield." Thomas explained the strange encounter as best he could, repeating Margaret's words about pretense and old business between their families, none of which he understood. Frederick frowned thoughtfully. "Someone has clearly told her something, Thomas. Something convincing enough to turn her against you so completely and so suddenly. That sort of certainty does not arrive on its own." The thought struck Thomas with uncomfortable clarity. He considered his mother's evasive words from days before, wondering if Eleanor had intervened to push Margaret away, though something about that explanation did not sit entirely right within him either. It was Gerald, arriving unexpectedly, who unknowingly provided the next piece of the puzzle. "I happened to mention your visits to Bramfield to your cousin Josephine when she called on my wife last week," Gerald said casually. "She seemed quite interested in the details, more interested than I expected, truthfully." Thomas's expression shifted instantly. "Josephine," he repeated. "Beatrice's cousin." "The very same," Gerald confirmed, oblivious to the suspicion now forming rapidly behind Thomas's eyes. Thomas excused himself from the conversation as quickly as politeness allowed, his mind already moving toward Beatrice's recent behavior, the satisfied expression she had worn the night of the ball, her sharp questions about his rides to Bramfield in the days following. He confronted Beatrice directly the following afternoon, finding her in the drawing room of her family's townhouse. "What did you tell Margaret Cole?" Thomas asked without preamble, his patience for careful diplomacy entirely exhausted. Beatrice's composure flickered for only a moment before resettling into practiced calm. "I have no idea what you mean. I have never spoken a single word to that girl beyond our brief introduction at the ball." "You did not need to speak to her directly," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "You sent something instead. A letter, perhaps, designed to make her believe my visits were motivated by something other than apology." Beatrice's laugh came too quickly, too forced to be genuine. "You are imagining conspiracies where none exist, Thomas. Perhaps the girl simply realized on her own that continued attention from you would only invite further scandal upon her family, and decided wisely to end the matter herself." Thomas studied her carefully, searching for any crack in her composure, though Beatrice held her expression steady, despite the accusation hanging heavy in the air between them. "I will discover the truth eventually," Thomas said quietly, turning toward the door. "And when I do, you should understand that whatever understanding our families once expected between us will end entirely." Beatrice's smile remained fixed in place even after he left, though her fingers trembled slightly around the teacup in her hand, the first visible crack in a plan she had believed entirely secure. Thomas sent word to a clerk he trusted, a careful man named Nathaniel Price, asking him to quietly compare the forged letter, borrowed briefly from a servant at the cottage who owed him a small favor, against samples of Josephine's own handwriting, gathered from old correspondence kept within his mother's household records. Nathaniel returned 3 days later with confirmation that the slanted letters and particular curve of certain words matched Josephine's hand closely enough to leave little doubt. Thomas felt grim satisfaction settle over him, though it brought him no closer to repairing what had already broken in Margaret's trust. He arranged a small gathering at Penmore Hall under the pretense of discussing wedding preparations between two distant cousins, ensuring both Beatrice and Josephine would be present alongside witnesses who held no loyalty to either woman. During the gathering, Thomas produced the forged letter before the assembled guests, alongside Nathaniel's written comparison, explaining calmly exactly what had been discovered. Josephine's face drained of color immediately, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as every eye in the room turned toward her. "I never meant for it to go so far," Josephine stammered, glancing desperately toward Beatrice for support that did not come. "It was only meant to discourage a foolish attachment, nothing more." Beatrice, sensing the situation collapsing beyond her control, attempted to distance herself entirely. "I had no knowledge of any letter," she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual confident edge. "Whatever my cousin chose to do was entirely her own decision." Gerald looked between the two women with open disappointment. "Such schemes reflect poorly on every family involved," he said gravely. "I would advise both of you to consider carefully how this evening's revelations might affect your standing going forward." The gathering ended in quiet disgrace for both women, their reputations bruised among the small circle of guests who had witnessed the exposure firsthand. Thomas rode to Bramfield that very evening, the truth finally secured in hand, hopeful that proof of the deception might soften whatever wall Margaret had built between them. But Agnes met him with the same firm refusal as before, informing him that Margaret had already heard whispers of the gathering through a kitchen maid connected to the Penmore household, and wanted no part of further explanations, forged letters or otherwise. "Tell him," Margaret said from the top of the stairs, her voice carrying down to where Thomas stood in the doorway, "that knowing the letter was false changes nothing about what he said with his own mouth in front of an entire ballroom. A forged letter didn't put those words in his throat. He did that himself." Thomas stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, the truth he had fought so hard to uncover, feeling smaller than the wound he had caused, a wound no forgery had created, only his own careless tongue. Weeks passed, and the distance between Penmore Hall and the cottage in Bramfield seemed to grow wider with each unanswered note. Thomas stopped riding out every morning, though he never stopped thinking of Margaret, her steady voice through the upstairs window echoing through his mind during quiet hours when his duties allowed his thoughts to wander. Margaret, for her part, busied herself with small tasks around the cottage, mending dresses for neighbours who could pay only a few coins, helping her aunt manage the modest accounts that kept their household running. She told herself she had moved past the matter entirely, though Harriet noticed her niece often paused mid-task, staring out toward the road as if waiting for something she refused to admit she wanted. It was during this quiet stretch that a stranger arrived in Bramfield, a sharp-eyed solicitor named Mr. Alban Crewe, carrying papers that would unravel everything Eleanor had spent years trying to bury. Mr. Crewe requested an audience with Margaret directly, explaining that he represented the estate of a deceased shipping investor named Charles Whitmore, a man who had once partnered with Margaret's father before the business collapsed. "Your father did not simply lose his fortune through poor decisions," Mr. Crewe explained, settling a thick folder of documents onto the small table in the cottage's sitting room. "He was deliberately ruined by a partner who wished to seize control of the shipping routes entirely for personal gain." Margaret's hands stilled over the fabric in her lap. "What partner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Crewe hesitated, glancing toward Harriet before continuing. "The records show the scheme was financed quietly through the Ainsworth family, specifically through funds controlled at the time by the current Dowager Duchess, though I must stress that proving direct involvement after so many years will be difficult." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the small clock on the mantel. Margaret felt something cold settle deep in her chest. The pieces of a puzzle she had not even realized she was missing suddenly sliding into place with painful clarity. "So the family that ruined my father is the same family whose son humiliated me before half the county, Margaret said slowly, testing the weight of the words as she spoke them aloud for the first time. It would appear so, Mr. Crewe confirmed gently, though he added that the documents alone were not enough to prove the full extent of Eleanor's involvement without further investigation. Margaret thanked him for the information, though her mind raced long after he departed, torn between fury at a family that seemed determined to wound her in every possible way, and a strange, unwelcome ache at the thought that Thomas himself might have known nothing of his mother's old schemes. Meanwhile, at Penmore Hall, Eleanor received an urgent letter from her solicitor warning her that Mr. Crewe had been making inquiries into old shipping records connected to the Whitmore estate. Eleanor's composure cracked for the first time in years as she read the warning, understanding immediately that her carefully buried secret was beginning to surface after more than a decade of silence. She summoned Thomas to her study once more, though this time her voice carried none of its usual command. "There is something I must tell you before others tell you first," Eleanor said, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "Years ago, before you were old enough to understand such matters, I made an investment decision that ruined a man named Charles Cole, Margaret's father." Thomas felt the floor seem to shift beneath him. "You ruined her father," he repeated, disbelief and growing anger mixing dangerously in his voice. "I did not intend ruin," Eleanor said quickly, though her words carried little conviction even to her own ears. "I intended only to secure our family's position during a difficult period. The collapse of his business was an unfortunate consequence I did not fully anticipate at the time." "An unfortunate consequence," Thomas repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "Mother, that unfortunate consequence cost a man his entire livelihood and left his daughter to grow up in poverty and shame. And you knew this when you tried to keep me away from her. You knew this when you let Beatrice and her cousin destroy what little trust remained between us." Eleanor's silence confirmed everything he needed to know. Thomas left his mother's study without another word, his mind consumed entirely by the need to see Margaret immediately, to tell her the full truth himself before Mr. Crewe's investigation or idle gossip twisted the story into something even more painful than it already was. He rode to Bramfield that same evening, arriving just as the last light of day faded behind the hills surrounding the cottage. This time, when Agnes answered the door, she did not turn him away immediately, sensing something different in his expression that suggested the matter could no longer wait. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind Agnes, her face carefully composed despite the turmoil Thomas suspected churned beneath her calm exterior. "I already know," Margaret said, before he could speak a single word. "Mr. Crewe visited me this morning with papers connecting your mother to my father's ruin." Thomas felt something heavy settle in his chest at her words, though he forced himself to continue regardless. "Then you understand why I came. I had no knowledge of what my mother did until this very evening. I would never have allowed such cruelty to continue if I had known the truth sooner." Margaret studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of deception, though she found only the same raw honesty she had glimpsed briefly the night of the ball before everything fell apart between them. "Knowing the truth does not undo what has already happened," Margaret said quietly. "Your mother ruined my father. You humiliated me in front of an entire ballroom. Beatrice and her cousin tried to poison whatever small trust remained. I am tired, Thomas. I am tired of being a piece moved around in games played by your family." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, though no words felt adequate enough to address the weight of everything she had named. "I am not asking for trust right now," Thomas said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I am only asking that you allow me to make amends, in whatever way you believe is right, even if that means I must spend years proving myself worthy of being heard." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them, while Agnes hovered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene or withdraw entirely. "I need time," Margaret finally said. "Not for your sake. For mine." She closed the door gently this time, without the harsh finality of their previous encounter, leaving Thomas standing on the porch with something that felt almost like hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself unable to settle fully back into her old routines. She would begin a piece of mending, only to set it aside minutes later, her thoughts drifting toward the conversation at the door, toward the rawness in Thomas's voice when he had admitted his mother's wrongdoing without attempting to soften the truth or excuse himself from blame entirely. Harriet noticed the change in her niece, though she said little beyond gentle observations offered over their evening tea. "You have not mentioned him once since that evening," Harriet remarked one night, watching Margaret stare absently into the fire rather than at the book open in her lap. "Yet you think of him constantly. I can see it in the way you forget what page you are reading." Margaret closed the book entirely, setting it aside with a small sigh. "I do not know what to do with what I feel, Aunt Harriet. Anger feels simpler. Anger does not ask me to risk anything further." Harriet reached over, covering her niece's hand with her own weathered fingers. "Anger protected you when you needed protecting, child. But it cannot be the only thing you carry forward for the rest of your life." Meanwhile, at Penmore Hall, word of Eleanor's confession to Thomas had begun circulating among the household staff, who whispered among themselves about the sudden tension between mother and son that had settled over the estate like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Frederick, visiting once more under the pretense of discussing business matters, found Thomas distracted and unusually quiet during what should have been a straightforward conversation about shared investments. "You have hardly spoken 2 full sentences since I arrived," Frederick observed, setting down his teacup. "Whatever weighs on you, it clearly concerns more than ledgers and shipping contracts." Thomas explained everything then, the discovery of his mother's old scheme, the conversation with Margaret on her doorstep, the strange mixture of hope and uncertainty that had settled over him since that evening. Frederick listened carefully, offering no immediate judgment until Thomas finished speaking entirely. "You cannot undo what your mother did," Frederick said finally, "but you can choose, every single day going forward, to be nothing like her in how you treat the people who trust you with their hearts." Thomas considered this carefully, recognizing the truth in Frederick's words, even as he wrestled with how exactly to demonstrate such change through action rather than mere intention. It was Mr. Crewe's unexpected visit to Margaret regarding the Whitmore settlement that finally shifted the careful standstill both Margaret and Thomas had settled into, forcing each of them to consider what they truly wanted once practical circumstances no longer stood quite so heavily in the way. News of Eleanor's old scheme spread through the county faster than anyone anticipated, carried first by Mr. Crewe's careful inquiries, and then by servants who could not resist sharing such a delicious piece of gossip. Within days, the story reached every drawing room from Bramfield to Penmore, leaving Eleanor's reputation in tatters and the Ainsworth name whispered about with a different kind of attention than the family had ever experienced before. Beatrice, sensing the shifting tides of opinion, attempted one final maneuver to salvage her own position. She visited Eleanor directly, proposing that a hasty engagement announcement between herself and Thomas might distract society from the scandal entirely, redirecting attention toward a joyful occasion rather than old wrongs freshly uncovered. Eleanor, weakened by the public exposure and desperate for any path back toward respectability, agreed to support the idea, sending word to Thomas that an announcement would be made within the week, regardless of his personal feelings on the matter. Thomas refused outright the moment he received his mother's message, riding immediately to confront her in person. "I will not marry Beatrice," Thomas said firmly, standing before his mother's desk with a resolve she had never witnessed in him before. Not to save our reputation, not to satisfy society's expectations, and certainly not after everything her family has already done to hurt people I care for. Eleanor's composure finally broke entirely, years of careful control crumbling in front of her son. "Then what would you have me do, Thomas? Watch our family name dissolve into nothing, while you chase after a girl with no fortune and no standing?" "I would have you take responsibility," Thomas said quietly. "For Charles Cole, for Margaret, for everything your ambition cost people who never had the power to stop you." Eleanor said nothing further, though something in her expression suggested, perhaps for the first time, genuine remorse rather than mere concern for appearances. Later that same evening, Eleanor sought out Mr. Crewe herself, arriving at the small office he had rented in the village without informing Thomas of her intentions beforehand. "I wish to make this right, as much as such things can be made right after so many years," Eleanor said, her usual commanding presence noticeably absent as she sat across from the solicitor. "Whatever settlement the Whitmore estate determines is fair. I will ensure it is honoured fully and without delay from my own family's resources as well." Mr. Crewe studied her carefully, surprised by the sudden shift after years of careful silence surrounding the matter. "That is a generous offer, Your Grace, though I confess I did not expect it given the circumstances. Perhaps I should have offered it years ago," Eleanor replied quietly, before pride and fear convinced me that silence was easier than facing what I had done. Word of Thomas's refusal reached Beatrice within hours, delivered by Josephine, who had grown increasingly distant from her cousin since the public exposure of their forged letter scheme. Beatrice, finding herself without allies and without the engagement she had counted on, withdrew from society entirely, retreating to her family's country estate to wait out the worst of the scandal in relative seclusion. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly visited by Mr. Crewe once more, this time bearing news that shifted everything yet again. "The Whitmore estate has agreed to a settlement," Mr. Crewe explained, given the clear evidence of wrongdoing uncovered during the investigation. "A portion of the original shipping profits, adjusted for the years since your father's ruin, will be restored to you as his rightful heir." Margaret stared at the documents Mr. Crewe presented, hardly able to process the sudden shift in her circumstances after years of careful frugality and quiet struggle. "This changes nothing about what happened at the ball," Margaret said slowly, though her voice carried less certainty than it had during her previous conversations with Thomas. "It changes your circumstances considerably," Mr. Crewe replied gently. "What you choose to do with that change remains entirely your own decision." After Mr. Crewe departed, Margaret sat alone for a long while in the quiet sitting room, turning the documents over in her hands, as though the paper itself might offer answers her own heart had not yet settled upon. She thought of her father, of the years spent mending dresses to afford simple necessities, of the pride she had built carefully around her own resilience, because resilience was the only inheritance she believed remained to her. Now, suddenly, she possessed something more, though the timing felt strange, arriving only after she had learned to survive entirely without it. 3 days later, Thomas returned to Bramfield once more, though this time he arrived on foot rather than horseback, carrying nothing but a small velvet pouch and a request for a few minutes of Margaret's time. Margaret met him in the small garden behind the cottage, the same modest space where she had once tended vegetables to help her aunt stretch their limited resources further. "I heard about the settlement," Thomas said, watching her carefully for any sign of how she wished him to proceed. "I am glad some measure of justice has finally reached you, even after everything my family did to delay it." Margaret nodded slowly, accepting the sentiment without offering immediate forgiveness in return. "I have spent these past weeks thinking carefully about what I want, Thomas. Not what society expects, not what would satisfy anyone watching from the outside. Simply what I want for myself." "And what is that?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning beneath his calm exterior. "I want honesty," Margaret said firmly. "I want to be introduced as myself, fully and completely, never again as nobody important standing beside someone who matters more. If you cannot offer that, then nothing else you bring me will matter at all." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Then let me start again, properly this time. Margaret Cole, daughter of Charles Cole, a woman who held her composure through humiliation, who refused easy forgiveness, who deserves every bit of respect this county has denied her until now." Margaret felt something shift within her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something close enough to hope that she allowed herself a small, genuine smile for the first time since the night of the ball. "I am not promising anything beyond this conversation," Margaret said carefully, though her tone had softened considerably from their previous exchanges. "I am not asking for promises," Thomas replied, "only for the chance to prove, through actions rather than careless words, exactly how important you have always been." They stood together quietly in the small garden a while longer, neither moving closer nor stepping away, simply existing in a space that no longer felt entirely hostile, though it had not yet become entirely safe either. The evening air carried the scent of late blooming flowers, and somewhere beyond the garden wall a dog barked twice before falling silent again. The story does not end here with easy answers wrapped neatly together, because life rarely offers such convenient endings. Margaret continued rebuilding her own life with her newly restored inheritance, choosing her own path forward, regardless of whatever role Thomas might eventually play within it. Eleanor faced the consequences of her past actions through diminished standing and a son who no longer trusted her judgment without question. Beatrice and Josephine found their own reputations forever altered by choices made out of jealousy and desperation. Now I want to ask you something before you go. If someone you once trusted finally told you the truth, only after their lies had already caused you pain, would you forgive them simply because the truth finally arrived? Or does truth delivered too late lose its power to heal anything at all? Tell me what you believe in the comments below, and tell me which corner of the world you watched this story from tonight, because I read every single response and reply to as many as I possibly can.